it just struck me as being fundamentally unfair. People should have a safe, healthy, permanent place to live. And that's kind of what really got me into architecture. I mean, at this point, you really can't talk about architecture without talking about sustainability.
Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavours of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your questions answered, and contribute to the community dialogue. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our weekly Passive House Accelerator live webinars. You can also check out our Reimagined Buildings YouTube channel for some great inspiration for both building new or renovating. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, here in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack Semke, coming to you from Seattle, Washington.
How's it going, Zack?
It's going great. How are you, Matthew?
Yep, pretty good. Still school holidays as we're recording here. Had a bit of weather, but I understand that there's been a bit of weather in New York this last week too.
Oh my goodness, no kidding. Crazy flooding. Yeah. A massive amount of water there.
Although I also heard that New York, being what it is, drains relatively quickly. So back to business, but yeah, some of those images were pretty interesting.
Yeah, no kidding. Feel for those guys.
Yeah, I definitely feel for those guys, and but also hopefully that continues to raise a bit of awareness of some relatively extreme events that just keep on happening.
Yeah, I saw an image on LinkedIn showing New York just a few months ago with all the wildfire smoke. The yellow skies in Manhattan, and then an image of the flooding going on. It's just that juxtaposition of these two extremes that we're swinging between. Yeah.
Well, aside from that, you've been looking at some stats this week.
Yes, I learned something new this week, and that is that the projection for solar deployment around the world for 2023 is 392 gigawatts, and that last year it was 252 gigawatts. So we're talking about a near doubling of annual solar deployment in just a single year. And this is shared by Auke Hoekstra, who is famous for this graph that shows the disjuncture between the actual solar exponential solar uptake that's been happening for decades now, and the linear projections that the International Energy Agency continues to make every year, despite all the evidence that we're seeing exponential growth. So it's really incredible, really, I mean, kind of bananas that we're looking at almost doubling in a single year. So that's hopeful.
It is hopeful. It's almost like the Energy Agency ignored what looks a bit like Moore's law for solar, where there's this exponential growth, doubling of output and reduction of cost, and their continued assumption that things were just going to flatline and level out. It just never happened. But they just kept thinking, oh, this must be it. Meanwhile, the graph just goes up and up and up.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the name for that is it's sometimes called Wright's law, sometimes Swanson's law. But this effect that happens with every doubling of solar deployment, we see the cost of solar drop by a certain percentage, and that recently that's been, like in the last decade or so, that's been a 38%. So every time we see this doubling, the cost of solar goes down by almost half.
Yeah.
And so that means that there's more demand for this cheaper energy. So exponential growth is driven, and there is this virtuous cycle that it gets set up. And that's because solar is a technology, not a fuel, not a like extracted commodity from the ground. And that's a kind of a paradigm shift, I think, for the International Energy Agency. And they've been slowly, I think, coming around, but, it's almost comical to look at this graph. I'll include a link to it.
Comical in a good way.
Wow. No, totally.
Yeah. Well, something that came across, it's not really something I learnt this week, but something that's come across my desk and with more frequency recently is to do with insulating concrete slabs. And it's a little bit of context. Here in New Zealand, Australia, we don't have basements. We don't tend to have basements. We just put concrete on the ground, and then timber frame above that concrete, and that means that on the edge where the wall joins the concrete slab is a tricky point for thermal bridging. And a lot of people, a lot of architects, a lot of designers spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to insulate the edge of that concrete slab that faces the outside air to reduce the thermal bridge at that point. And it can be done, and there are some very good details put out by people like the Building Science Corporation who have solved this problem a long time ago, but there are issues around different cladding types and the aesthetic of how that looks that causes issues. Anyway, a solution for that, which is a little bit counterintuitive when I first saw it, is to insulate the inside of the slab, so on top of the concrete floor, which is a bit it's counterintuitive for two reasons. One is that we always talk about the benefits of external insulation instead of internal insulation, and this is saying, well, just put the insulation on top of the slab, so it's kind of inside the structure of the building. And it also means that you don't have to worry about any of the insulation on the outside, and you don't end up with any of the theoretical thermal mass benefits of the concrete slab. The reality is that in a passive house, that thermal mass has limited use anyway, particularly if you cover it up with carpet and other floor coverings. So this is becoming people are starting to look at this as a more viable option, a simpler option, just pouring a straight concrete slab and then putting a layer of either XPS, or PIR, and then a strand board or something over that on top as your floor. It's a much simpler detail. I might post a link to that if I'm not describing it as clearly as I need to. But it's an interesting learning for me that's coming up more often as a viable option for a simple detail of reducing that thermal bridge on that bottom corner, which is all about reducing condensation, really, and reducing the risk of condensation forming, while also reducing a bit of heat loss. So, we continue to come across more details, and as we're very familiar with in the Passive House community, people sharing those details and having good discussions about what works and what doesn't, which is great.
Awesome.
Which is also a bit of a theme for your interview this week about sharing of good information and keeping things moving and sharing learning, which was really cool to hear as well. But before we get into that, let's take some time to thank our sponsors.
Yeah, absolutely. So a big thank you to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Dattner Architects, Glavel, Minutair, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. And thanks to our champion sponsors, Bewizo, Gradient, Icon Windows and Doors, Intelligent Membranes, PH Air Seal, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big shout out to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
All right. Well, tell us how you came across Shefali Sanghvi.
Well, Shefali Sanghvi is the Director of Sustainability at Dattner Architects. And Dattner Architects is one of the big movers and shakers in passive house design in New York. And so they're designing some of the largest Passive House projects there in the city. They just won a bunch of awards for their 425 Grand Concourse project, which is a FIA certified Passive House project. And they have a number of other similar affordable housing projects where, they're bringing in this kind of equitable access to these buildings that are climate resilient and keep people healthy and happy. So one of those buildings is Vital Brookdale. And so Shefali shares with us why she's so fond of that project in particular. But she also goes into what you mentioned, which is what it means to be a director of sustainability at a firm like Dattner, and the learnings that she is and her colleagues are kind of sharing across the board, so that the whole firm and the industry as a whole can do better buildings quicker, more cost effectively, all of those things. So really inspiring work that Shefali is doing, and it was great to catch up with her for the podcast. I'm super excited to have Shefali Sanghvi, the Director of Sustainability, Senior Associate at Dattner Architects, joining us on the Passive House podcast. Shefali, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm also super excited to be here and talk to you about all the things that make me who I am and drive me to do the work that I do.
Oh, that's perfect. I can't wait. So let's start with how did you get into all of this? What's your story?
Sure. So I was born in India, and my parents came to the US when I was very young. And one of the things that we always did was watch Indian shows on like public television on the weekends. And so there was always a news segment. And when I was really young, it was really boring because it was all songs and like bright colors and music and then news. And then as I got older, I was listening, and without fail, during the monsoon season, there was always stories about people's homes getting washed away and how many people died and how many people like were homeless, and it just struck me as being fundamentally unfair that like people should have a safe, healthy, permanent place to live. And that's kind of what really got me into architecture. My background is in affordable housing. That's kind of what brought me into architecture. And then I was able to take that and this idea that you couldn't really talk about affordable housing without talking about sustainability. Because how could you say that a place was affordable if it was expensive to just operate, both from an owner point of view and from a tenant point of view? And so in my mind, it's all tied together. And I've really been fortunate enough that I've worked at firms that have supported my interest in sustainability and given me the sort of leeway to explore that further and really start thinking about things moving forward and pushing the envelope. And so I was able to leverage that into this director of sustainability role that is kind of new, right? I mean, Dattner really announced it last April for Earth Day. And we had been talking about it obviously for a little while, but I think it made a lot of sense for the type of work that Dattner did and the firm's commitment to sustainability to formalize it in this way that was really sort of outward facing. It was sort of this thought leadership position and sort of gave me this opportunity to talk about all of the things that I talk about in the office with people outside of the office.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think it's all kind of like, in my mind, everything comes together. And I mean, at this point, you really can't talk about architecture without talking about sustainability. That's kind of the world that we're in right now.
Yeah, that's right. And you're talking about affordable housing and sustainability and then also there's the sustainability and climate resilience. I think that, that probably came home a little bit with the wildfires that you guys were hit with. I mean, that's something that we've become really accustomed to. Of course, you all in New York have dealt with the hurricanes as well and flooding. So the kind of definition of frontline community it seems to be expanding as the climate crisis unfolds. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like really in the last, I don't know, like 10, 15 years with Hurricane Sandy and recognizing the difference between flooding and storm surge and, the role that infrastructure plays in all of this. And then COVID and indoor air quality and how important it is to have filtered air in your space. And then the wildfires, which we always sort of saw as a West Coast problem. We never thought in a million years that this would be something that we would have to deal with. And then just sort of like looking at these postal apocalyptic, just outside of the window. It wasn't even a photo, right?
Yeah. No,
and so seeing that, our part of this is that recognizing that the definition of sustainability is very wide reaching, but also is always changing. Because it is so contextual. It is so important. It ties to where you live or where you're building. And you can't just assume that what was true 15 years ago will be true now or be true 15 years from now. So I think like that facility or that ability to like address these things as they come up is a big part of it. But it also kind of goes into this question of, we know this stuff is coming and we should be a little more proactive rather than reactive.
Yeah.
And wouldn't it be nice if that was the world that we lived in?
Right. I couldn't agree more. And that notion that everything is always changing and evolving is so true. I mean, it's like the impacts that we're seeing are expanding and changing. The things that we're aware of, like embodied carbon, for example, has become something that's very often discussed in our circles in the last few years. Like those that are kind of conceptualization of what we need to hold as part of sustainability is expanding, and then also the context of and what is energy, what is where is energy coming from, and how is this all how do buildings interact and support the clean energy transition, and how do our calculations about where we're balancing things shift as that's going on. It's super interesting, and it must be. I think that a lot of listeners understand and know this, but I mean, Dattner is a massively important leader in the Passive House world specifically, but I think more generally the sustainable building realm with all of the kind of landmark buildings that you're doing in the city. So, I mean, what a cool place to be. In this leadership role that you're in. It must be super exciting and challenging.
Yeah. Yes to both. I mean, I think so I guess for those of you who are listening that are not aware, Dattner is a firm that's based in New York City, and a lot of the work that we do is sort of civic architecture. So we do transportation, infrastructure, healthcare, education, and affordable housing. And so basically the spaces that we live in, we work in, and we visit, it's really hard to be in New York City and not somehow pass through a space that Dattner has inspired or built in a given week. And
That's so cool.
And yeah, it is really cool. And it's not something that I even realized until I started working here. And I think that because of that, this idea that a lot of our work is really sort of based in sustainability makes a lot of sense. We are working with agencies that have a lot of operational concerns that also have to respond to administrations and the policies that they set. And we work with them to try to realize that and what makes sense. And then also from the housing side, we work with a lot of nonprofit developers that are really mission driven, that really do want to look at their bottom line and their tenants' bottom line of how can we make this place affordable to live while shifting to all electric, which in New York City is still incredibly expensive when compared to the cost of fossil fuel gas. Mm-hmm. And so I think this idea of all of this work sustainability is integral to all of the work that we do. And also we work with clients that are really open to having these discussions and understand the value of setting the stage, not only for now and for the people using our buildings now, but also for future generations. I think we're really fortunate in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what is it like to be the director of sustainability at Dattner? I mean, I gather that there has been an active sustainable practice group at Dattner for some years, right? So there's maybe a little bit of existing infrastructure that you probably, I suspect, helped build before you formally became the director. But yeah, I mean, what is that like? What are you doing? What are you all up to raise the bar around sustainability and equity and this connection between sustainability and affordability? Like,
Yeah, I mean, so we have a sustainable practice group, as you mentioned, that was formed in about around 2012 as a response to the firm signing off to the AIA 2030 challenge.
got it.
And so basically, when it started, the focus was really how do we reduce energy consumption? And it was just a group of really passionate employees that sat in a conference room once a month and talked about these things. And in the intervening years, as we discussed earlier, because definitions of sustainability change, we sort of expanded and created these 6 subcommittees. So we have a group that focuses on energy, another one on renewables, materials, indoor health, site ecology, and urban infrastructure. And generally speaking, all of those groups tie into the work that we do. And so it was really kind of a great way to get people who had like a very specific interest to understand how that tied into our sustainability goals at large. And so our group grew and kept growing and kept growing. And so the shift to the 6 subcommittees made a lot of sense because the meetings became slightly more manageable and we were able to sort of figure out what we were going to do. So we issued a sustainable outline spec where we talk about a lot of the materials that we commonly use and what are some red list materials that we should avoid and how can we make better decisions. And then what are the impact of those decisions, both to construction and also to budget, and how can we start having that conversation with contractors and owners about making the shift? We've done a lot of policy research. So we'll take the policy that is issued, one or two people will read it in depth, provide an executive summary so that everyone in the firm is sort of better suited to meet those challenges and start having those discussions with owners. So we did a big push in 2019 when the Climate Mobilization Act in New York City was passed, right? I mean, the big law that everyone's talking about now in New York is Local Law 97. But it was passed 4 years ago. Right? And so it's just this idea that these are things that we need to know as practitioners, and it's in our best interest to sort of be at the forefront. And so this group has really grown from this 5 passionate people into about 80 staff members.
Oh, wow.
In a firm of 110. That's pretty significant.
Yeah.
And it's kind of great. And I think selfishly, would I prefer that all of the staff members were in sustainable practice group? Yeah.
Yeah, right.
But I also know that that's not reasonable. And so I was co-chair for a few years and then became a committee chair. And I think being able to talk to people outside of my housing studio and to sort of see what other studios were doing and what their focus was gave me this opportunity to have this slightly more holistic, non-housing focused look. I mean, housing, don't get me wrong, I love housing. There's a reason I really want to do passive house buildings everywhere. But it's all of the work that we do is important. And so now as this director of sustainability role, it's kind of the best of all worlds. I still get to work on housing, but I get to consult with project teams internally with making sure that we are developing kind of our own sustainable project requirements and saying okay, this is what the client wants. These are their concerns. What can we do that works within those parameters? And how can we make sure that we are being kind of the best version of ourselves? And that's the way that I keep explaining it to everyone. I'm I just want our projects to be the best version of itself. That's it.
Right.
I'm not here to tell you that you're doing something wrong or that let's change everything or increase the scope by 50%. I don't want to do any of those things. I want to work with you and the limitations that you already have and acknowledge that those limitations often are really important to everyone. They're not just set arbitrarily. to make sure that we're doing the best that we can do and that we're letting our clients know why this is important, because then hopefully they can take that knowledge and move it forward to the next project. And the same with the contractors, that we can tell them, like, this is why this detail looks a little different from everything you've done so far. Here's why this is important. Let's talk about whether or not you agree. Let's have that discussion instead of me coming in and being like, nope, you're wrong. This is the way we do things now. Do it. Or, I'm not going to sign your rec or whatever role we have in that kind of position, condition. And that in the idea that, like, maybe the next time it's a little easier. And then they start thinking about it from that point of view and come to us and say, like, hey, I know you drew it this way, but if we did it this way, it would be much easier from a construction sequencing point of view while still meeting your intent. Right. And then we can take that detail and bring it to another project, right? And so it's this idea that it's this like weird, like multi-pronged organism that is going through and trying to shift the way we all think about the way we design and build buildings. I think for me, that's been the most exciting part. I'm getting a lot of exposure to work that I have not really done in my career so far, but I'm able to have like really engaging and exciting and honestly inspiring conversations about how we can change the way that we work and the way that we think about these things and how we can just keep building better buildings. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. And it really resonates kind of at a personal level, because sort of the, I guess, theory of change at Passive House Accelerator is this notion that if we can figure out how to share lessons learned with one another effectively and learnings, and that we'll be able to do a better and better job with these buildings, and also make them more cost effective, and just get to a place where, as we see, kind of there's this analog in the clean energy space where and this is purely on the kind of like the technology innovation, but where all these little micro innovations result in these really powerful learning effects that drive down cost. And of course, cost is not the only measure that we're looking at, but just this idea of like, how do we kind of systematize that learning and the sharing of the learning, so that we as a community can kind of all rise to this occasion, since we need to get on with it. So I'm hearing that you're kind of creating some robust systems to enable that internally at Dattner, which is pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I just want to say, like, I agree with that sentiment that we're only going to be successful in addressing the built environment's impact to this like climate emergency we're in if we share information with each other.
Yeah.
And this idea that this is like, oh, my intellectual property, or like I did it and I want people to come to me because I am the only one that can provide this service, is really self-defeating. I mean, I feel like we have, I'm sorry to use such strong language, but we have a moral obligation to share the lessons we've learned so that everyone can learn from them and that everyone can bring us forward and that we continue to move forward together, right? There's like that saying that I like stand on the shoulders of giants that have come before me. And I feel like that is always true. And hopefully we're just sort of like increasing the height of those giant shoulders a little bit more so somebody else can learn and do something a little better, because like that is really it. I mean, talking about that sustainable outline spec that I was referring to earlier, we are not scientists, we're architects. Like we don't know how to research those things. So we used a lot of like Healthy Materials Lab and like, Healthy Building Network. And we use like some of the stuff that Perkins and Will have done to like help take this and aggregate it and sort of say like, you, the project architect for this project, don't have the time to read all these resources. So let's help you take all that information and put it in one place where like maybe now you just have to look here instead of looking at 10 different places to figure out what the right answer is. And I think like that's kind of true for everything that we do. And, obviously like Passive House, we talk about building tightness, we talk about reducing our, energy consumption and reducing our heating load and cooling load. But it's all related, right? I mean, there's the resiliency aspect, I think, is really clear when we talk about passive house, but also this idea of indoor health. We're building this very tight building, we're bringing in ventilation, but like, then let's not fill our buildings with plastic.
Right,
Let's
right.
just not do that, right? Like, so I think that it's a good way to start having this conversation and sort of saying, like, okay, if we're doing this, then we should think about this. And how much more is it to do something better in that area? And I think that passive house is a great way to start having that conversation that like speaks to the receiving person's values, whether it's the owner and their only concern is budget, how much is this going to cost me? Whether it's the contractor and their concern is budget, obviously, but also time. What's the lead time on this? And you're making me learn something new, and it reduces my efficiency or my ability to do this. And I think like by sharing information, we also kind of share this ability to talk to people who are not architects, which often architects have a hard time doing, right? We use a lot of acronyms. We have this sort of insular community of like-minded folks, but to be able to talk to people so that they feel heard and they feel like you're speaking to them on their level is part of what we need to do to be successful. This feels like a very tangential thing, but I don't know. I think it's all kind of part and parcel of the same discussion.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's fantastic. So it seems like a good kind of moment to then dive into a project that it makes all of these ideas manifest, or at least I know that's the goal. And that's there are lots of projects that we could choose from Dattner, and we're actually doing a video project right now on the 425 Grand Concourse project, which I know this community is pretty familiar with. It's won a bunch of awards. And another really exciting project that Dattner has worked on is the Vital Brookdale project. So can we dive into that a little bit, and this idea of delivering the health benefits, or delivering on indoor air quality, delivering on climate resilience, and doing that through passive house and doing it equitably?
Sure. So Vital Brookdale is a passive house project in Brooklyn, in Brownsville. And so it was part of New York State's Vital initiative, which basically worked with a number of hospitals to create health and wellness oriented affordable housing in underserved areas of Brooklyn that had high asthma rates and kind of didn't have a lot of community infrastructure. And so part of the idea was that we would work with these hospitals. There would be an outpatient facility that we include as part of some of the land that they were ceding over to the project. But the focus was affordability and health and wellness. And so when we got the project, this overlap of health and wellness and affordability really lent itself well to passive house. And so we started planting that seed in the client's mind fairly early. We're like, it's one thing to say that you're designing a passive house standards, and it's another thing to actually do the work, because we talked about the dangers of designing the passive house standards without having a third party there to check for condensation, to check to make sure the work is being done, and what is the additional soft cost associated with it. And, so this project started in 2019, and the policy landscape in New York City in 2019 is a little different than what we have now. So this idea that we were providing electrical heating was like, oh my God, who is paying for that? And how are we going to do our utility allowances? And how are we going to structure our rent? And so it definitely required buy-in. We had the contractor come to a lot of design meetings so that we could talk to them and we could figure out the best way forward in terms of detailing. And it required the client talking to the state affordable housing agency to sort of say okay, we want to do this electrical heating and cooling scenario. How does that work with our pro forma? How does that work with, rent, et cetera, et cetera? But, ultimately, I think, and you've mentioned this twice before, and I haven't really addressed it head on, I think it really also ties to equity. We're saying that we're providing this affordable housing project with an all-electric heating and cooling system. And yes, the owner pays for the heating, but we're giving them the option for cooling. So if we don't do the work that's needed in building tightness and building envelope performance, then what are you really doing? What are we really saying in terms of, is this true affordable housing? Because again, electricity right now in New York City is significantly more expensive than gas. And so I think knowing that the writing was on the wall with Local Law 97 and that we would have to care about our emissions, all of these little things really pushed us to be able to get Passive House. And then sort of saying okay, we're doing all electric. We have to pay attention to the building envelope and the building performance so that it isn't cost prohibitive to operate this building.
Right.
And so this site is very unique. It was a former surface parking lot for Brookdale Hospital. It is in multiple zoning districts, all of this other stuff. But what we ended up with is this very long scheme. And so it's kind of the antithesis of what we think of housing in New York City, where it's a tight footprint and it just keeps going up. And this is a very long footprint that's capped at 6 and 7 stories. And so from a Passive House point of view, we really had to care about our form factor. And all of a sudden, everything that we were doing at the exterior had a lot of importance. So we had to find this balance with our sustainability consultant. In this project, it was Bright Power, and make sure that our windows were right size. They wanted them very small. We wanted them very big. Because,
classic.
Yeah, classic. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And also, we're architects. We want these buildings to look good. We want the quality of life for the residents to be great. And, if we were going to have to lose some space on the inside because we have to provide all this, this double shaft wall for the VRF units and for the refrigerant piping, the least we could do was provide a great sized window so that you felt like there was a point of being in these spaces. Mm-hmm. And so we ended up with, I think, a great balance on the exterior, but then they were we have to reduce our demand. We have to reduce our demand. And so we're can we add any more insulation to the exterior wall? And they're no. Because the building was so long, our roof was so important that we ended up with R70 insulation at the roof, which is more than double code.
Right.
So it was we were damn, this is a lot of insulation. And so we had to go back to the client or the contractor and be guys, I know it says R70. That is not a typo. We need R70 insulation. And it was just it seems like such a silly thing to harp on, but it was one of those things that's okay, if this is the design we want, then this is what we have to do. This is kind of the,
right.
This is the, concession that we have to make.
Yeah.
But the other benefit of the project, because it was so long, is that we were able to put a pretty significant solar array on one of the roofs. So we have 100 kilowatt hour solar array, and we maxed out because that was it. That was the common load that we could carry with that solar array. If we had, in this fictitious world where master metering is a reasonable thing to do in New York City, if we had done that, we could have had so much on-site energy that we could have been really close to net zero. Wow. In this particular project, our site and source EUI are they're just this far apart. Whereas usually, they're so close, they're just a few numbers off. Whereas normally we see that it's twice or 3 times as more when you look at site versus source EUI. So anyway, I'm biased about the project. I really like it, but part of this health and wellness thing gave us this opportunity to really start paying attention to the materials we were using inside the project. We were spending so much budget on building systems and all of this insulation, right? R70 at the roof again.
Yeah, right.
And so how could we think about providing alternatives just as a baseline to the typical PVC products that we used? And how can we have that very reasonable conversation with the client of this is why we're proposing something that's a little different. And so we work with our interiors department to sort of say, I want PVC free alternatives to everything that you typically spec for an affordable housing project. And by and large, we were able to get a lot of that in because the pricing was not significant. The price increase rather was not significant. The one place we were not able to get it in, and this is really unfortunate, is the apartment flooring. It's full of the PVC flooring, like so many affordable housing projects in New York City, but that was just a numbers game, right? It was
Yeah.
so
It's
hard
just
to
too
say
much.
that it's just too much. It's too
Yeah.
much square footage that an
Mm.
incremental cost really does add up over the cost of the project. But, I hate to say it, but honestly, if that was the thing, I'm okay. I have to get my wins where I can get them.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
think that it's a good example. I mean, all the passive house projects we've done are working on are fantastic. 425 is a great project, and really sort of set the stage of how sustainability and affordability can be intertwined in New York City. But the reason I like Vital Brookdale, which is kind of like this unassuming 6-7 story building,
Right.
is that we were really able to take this like ethos behind passive house and push it to really make sure that we're making the right decisions on the inside of the building in terms of finishes, et cetera, and not just building systems and the building envelope.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. So this was probably would have been really early days in terms of conversations about embodied carbon. Was that something that you guys were grappling with on this project as well, or yeah, what's the story there?
No, unfortunately not.
Yeah.
I mean, we are studying embodied carbon and how we can make good decisions on this, and like we try to use tools that are available to all of us as architects, like EC3 and Tally and Insight for preliminary like energy performance or building performance, I guess. And so like now we know that some of it is just sourcing. If you can keep it steel and concrete, but just source it from the right places, you can have a significant impact to embodied carbon. Yeah. But at the time, that wasn't really part of the discussion. And the reality is like that building, we did we started design in 2019. We started construction in April 2020. So the entire construction process happened during COVID, which I think is also really kind of fantastic. And we passed our blower door test on the first try. So I think these are all really great things. Yeah. That building, the way that it's designed, could not be built now because things have shifted so much from a policy point of view that like that project had gas-fired domestic hot water. And we can't do that anymore with the passage of Local Law 154. Like, or this all electrification bill that's been passed at the city level. And then there through budget actions, it was also passed at the state level. Like, sure, there's a timeline for affordable housing, but why build a building that can work in 2025, but not work in 2026? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So, I think that's kind of really fantastic that in just 4 years, that building is no longer code compliant.
Right.
In spite of it being this great building that is performing really well.
Yeah.
And I think that is kind of a testament to the way that both the city and the state is looking at what we need to do to address where we are in terms of climate.
Yeah.
And also like both the city and the state, the affordable housing agencies, like recognizing that we play a role in making sure that we're looking at operational and embodied carbon and healthy materials. And that, part of it is like, if you have a choice between doing it and not doing it, you're always going to kind of choose the more cost-effective option.
Right.
So if there's someone sort of setting the stage and saying like, you can't do this anymore, then it'll help push the bar even further. And so it feels weird to talk about how great it is that this project could not be built now. But I think it's really important to mention that this building, which only was occupied last year, is already out of date. And like, I would not have thought that I would be able to say that in my lifetime, let alone like 4 years.
Right. And it's future-proofed in terms of its energy performance, and its envelope and all of the work that you did to dial that in. But we're fortunately moving away from burning fossil fuels in our buildings, which is like super, super important. So
yeah. And maybe it could have been done a little earlier, but you know what? Honestly, I'll take it. I'll take it, because when almost all of your decisions are cost driven, like a lot of our work is in this, the civic realm, as I characterize it, it's it's important that it is a multi-pronged effort, that it's not just us saying like, guys, this is the right thing. Like, let me talk to you about why this is important. Sometimes that works. Oftentimes it doesn't. So when policy comes in and says like, cool, it doesn't matter what you think, this is what you have to do. I'm glad. I'm like,
no, totally.
You be the
Totally.
heavy. I don't have to be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I had a fun conversation on the podcast with Andrew Steingeiser of RDH Building Science. He's based in their Boston office, and he was talking about all the changes that are happening, in many different jurisdictions that are adopting that. There's a stretch code and some opt-in code. I don't remember the terms, but the point is that a lot of jurisdictions are now essentially, for many building types, requiring passive house. And so it's completely changed the conversations that are happening with clients. It's not a matter of like needing to make the case that, yes, we should make the stretch, we should do it. And I think the interesting thing about that too is that then it opens up those the space for those conversations around other elements of sustainable building. So it does that. Yeah, there's kind of in some ways no substitute for good policy. Yeah. But I mean, I think there's a symbiotic relationship there, or hopefully a mutually supportive one, where then we can then show proof of concept that a low embodied carbon, option makes sense, or whatever it is that is the next frontier.
Yeah. And I think like as architects, we kind of also have this responsibility to help make those translations. Like all of our opposing interests have big lobbyists that like talk about these things and are the loudest voices in the room. And like, why not us? We are really well suited. We're uniquely suited to translate this idea of what it's like to live in a space, what it's like to operate a space, and what can we reasonably do to design a space. So why not take that knowledge and really advocate for the things that benefit the work that we do and benefit the people that use our buildings, right? I mean, like I wish, in many ways, I wish that someone would just come out and say, like, all housing in New York City has to be passive house. Like, that would be great. But also, that's not the world that we live in. So when you look at, okay, well, we've gotten this far, what are the things that are really holding us back? And then you can sort of start focusing your discussions on how do I convince you to do this little piece? You're right. It does open up that bandwidth to sort of say like, okay, well, we've already done this. So this next thing is only incrementally more. It's not exponentially cost prohibitive to go to like net zero or to like start looking at living building challenge or any of these other things that are out there that I think like we need to start looking at. We need to start looking at the way we design and build buildings more holistically and really like find a way to convey the sense of urgency that like we don't have time. Like we are out of time to sort of punt this can down the road and say that it's somebody else's problem.
Yeah, well said. So what's next on your docket? You have some exciting projects coming up?
Yeah, I'm working on a modular passive house building, which is very exciting.
Yeah.
I think, the benefits that we talk about for modular, where a lot of the work is done in a factory so that there is this level of oversight to the work, lends itself well to passive house. It'll be interesting to see how the centralized systems all connect when the modules come on site. And then I'm working on another project that is in a waterfront area in the South Bronx, and it's in a flood zone. So being able to leverage all these resiliency and sort of future-proof items that we're required to do from a code and agency point of view, and take that and say like, hey, we're already doing all of this. Passive house is just this much more. Why don't we talk about it and really sort of think about how this benefits you? And then, as I was saying earlier, just working on a number of projects in the office that are sort of unique typologies, and being able to say like, okay, this project has to be net zero or net zero ready. So let's design it to passive standards, because that's going to really reduce our electrical consumption and energy consumption of this project. So, I mean, I don't know, I'm excited to be able to be like the sustainability fairy of all the projects in our office and come in and say like, guys, let's do this a little better. Let's do this a little better. And then we have, working with firm standards. we have like a detail library where people pull details from, just making sure that all of these details are as close to Passive House. And it's like, oh, if this is what we should do. If you want to do a Passive House project, just increase this or do this a little differently. And I think like that's kind of what I'm excited for, is to bring this knowledge forward internally to people who may not be as convinced or may not have drunk the sustainability Kool-Aid like I so very obviously have. And get them to understand that all of this works really well in the way that they're already working.
Right. That's Shefali. This has been so inspiring and fun to hear about your work and how it's, being translated into the real world on projects, but also this internal work you're doing with the firm is really exciting. So, before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I should have thought about.
No.
Have thought about this. No, I mean, I think like, I guess the only thing I would say is like, it's not as hard as you think it is. It's not as hard as anyone thinks it is. Like the answers are here. Are there some things that are not quite there? Like, yeah, I would really love to figure out how to reasonably do battery storage in New York City. That would be great. And like, we are doing a lot of internal research on that and trying to make sure that we're well suited for the opportunity if and when it comes up. We're also like researching a lot on mass timber, which recently has been allowable in New York City. And so trying to make sure that we're well suited for that opportunity when it comes up. But I think like this sustainable practice group and the way that the firm looks at sustainability puts us in a really great position to look at what's coming down the pipeline and have done a lot of this research so that when we have that opportunity, we can just sort of hit the ground running and just do it. And I think part of that is just keeping in mind that like, it's not that hard. And this, like, where there's a will, there's a way, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Right. And it's just like, talk to your peers. Someone's done it. They are more than willing to talk to you about it. I am more than willing to talk about anything that Dattner has done as long as we can. We haven't signed an NDA of some sort, but that we have to just continue to talk to each other so that we can learn from one another and learn from our mistakes, be open about the mistakes, right, that happen. And because that is the way that we learn. I don't know. And like, just keep in mind that like, we can do it. It's just a few steps will take us to where we need to go. And when you think about it that way, I think it's a little easier to get it done and also to convince people who may not be as convinced as you are or as I am.
You're here. Well, thank you. Really appreciate this. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
And that was Shefali Sanghvi, who is the Sustainability Director at Dattner Architects. And we'll put a link to the project, the Vital Brookdale project there, so that people can check it out. It's pretty distinctive look of a building, and I get what she was talking about. It's not the typical sort of narrow, tall New York building, but it's more of a spread out building, constrained more by height than the width of it.
Right, and maybe I think she alluded to that some of the other buildings have or feel a little flashier, perhaps. This is a more of a mid-rise building, but it's like if we could replicate that over and over and over in cities around the world, it'd be a big piece of the sustainability puzzle.
Yeah. Well, as it says here on the information from on Dattner's side, it's the first project in New York State Vital Brooklyn initiative designed to improve Brooklyn's low-income residents' access to health, wellness, and housing. And I really like that coming together of health and wellness, which she talked about as well as being a big driver of her work.
I was struck by the comment that you made right before we recorded, which I think would be fun to talk about, which is the term sustainability. And could you say something about that?
Well, so I really like what Shefali talked about sustainability, always in the context of resilience and equity, or sustainability plus resilience and equity. I think those things are different. There is a difference between sustainability and resilience, but they go hand in hand. And I really like the focus on equity, because it's so much more than just energy efficiency, and it really thinks about giving people access to, like I said, their health and wellness and housing and permanent housing, which I really like what she said about people should have safe, healthy, permanent place to live. And that's just a really good starting point as an architect and as a urban planner, as someone designing policy. Just that underlying principle of people should have a safe, healthy, permanent place to live. And so many issues around property and affordability, and the haves and have-nots in terms of landlords, tenants, and inequities that are associated with that, I think have a lack of that principle of permanence, or we also call it security of tenure. So people just knowing that they have a place to live that's their own. They may not own it, but they have a right to be there for as long as they want or need to be there. And that has such a huge impact on people's health and just the wider community. So I really like those concepts that she talked about, and going back to her Shefali's origin story, you can kind of see where that's come through, right from that belief as a younger person of that should just be a right that people have to good housing. So that was kind of my main outtake about that topic of sustainability. Oh, and I guess the other piece is that Shefali also mentioned about sustainability is always changing, and I think that's true in the context of our reaction to events and our response to the climate and society. But I think the underlying principles of sustainability remain the same, and the sort of generally accepted definition of doing things today that aren't going to impact the future generations, that still remains. But what that looks like in real terms might change as we adapt to a new environment and new societal demands.
Yeah. And I think you also mentioned that just the fact that the term sustainability kind of fell out of fashion or use maybe a little bit, maybe, I don't know, what would you say, like 10 years ago?
Yeah, I feel like it was trendy in the 70s and then probably got overused a little bit and fell out of vogue a bit. But I think it's matured now into people having it as their profession. As a sustainability director is a thing, because we have all these other constructs that have real meaning, whether that's talking about both operational and embodied carbon, but these concepts of health, wellness, and the impacts of our housing on that. The equity piece and the affordability that I've just talked about, I think it's matured into a profession in its own right. So I think we use it it's a term that we can use with more confidence now, knowing not just those underlying principles, but what it actually means in real terms.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right on. Is that I think that maybe it fell out of fashion for a while because we started to wonder, well, what the heck is sustainability? And are we just saying sustainability so that we seem green and greenwashing and stuff? But now I think that because of the climate crisis and the housing crisis and equity crisis, all these different pressures that we're under, that those are all kind of clarifying a little bit of like, okay, this is where there is true meaning here for sure. And so that sudden it does feel more relevant. Of course, terms like that are also aspirational, just like the idea of a zero carbon building. That's it's something we're reaching for. It's not like anyone claims of that. Oh, well, this is a 100% sustainable building, but I think we know now the direction that we all need to be rowing toward as hard as we possibly can.
Yes, lots of really good stuff in there. Of course, Shefali also talked about sharing information. It's a common theme that we often hear in Passive House community. Interesting about price of electricity. Well, not just the supply of electricity, but just electrical infrastructure, and that is so high, which I think is really useful for context, because that's quite regionally specific, but potentially changing. But I think it's also important to appreciate the challenge of designers and architects to at the time of that building to work against those market trends. And of course, she says now that building would not have that gas infrastructure, which is a huge credit to the policymakers in New York State. Yeah.
And we know that the supply, there's going to be more and more demand for electricity as we decarbonize the buildings and transportation and things. So we know that there's lots of growth in the electricity grid required. So it's likely that those numbers are not going to go down. There's clearly a case for creating these buildings as efficiently as possible as we electrify.
And part of that efficiency, just to finish off, R70 in the roof.
Right.
I had to do a quick.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That makes sense for us here in the US.
Yeah. So that is still pretty big in metric terms. That would be R12, which is about double what our requirements would be here in Auckland as a sort of temperate climate. So that's a big chunk of insulation.
Yeah.
So impressive design, and check out the information available. There's some really good cross-section infographics on the Dattner website that you can see all of the features, the sustainability features that go into making it a pretty impressive building. Awesome. All right. Hey, well, thanks for that, Zach. It was a great interview, and really inspiring person to hear from. So I think that's it for this week. Apart from to say, check out the Passive House Accelerator website for upcoming events. You got a regular live program coming up.
That's right. We're on our kind of rotation, right? So first Wednesday is 101, second is Next Gen, third Wednesday of the month is Project Showcase, and fourth is Construction Tech. So you can look at that schedule, check that out. We'd love to see you join us on Passive House Accelerator Live, and then also keep your eyes open for information about FIASCon, which happens in Houston in November. We just wrapped up the Passive House Network Conference, and as we're taping, I can't say that I've had a personal experience yet, but I fly there tomorrow, so I'm sure it's going to be wonderful, and I'll share news from that later. But and Shefali was a presenter as part of that conference. So she's sharing her wisdom and experience with the community in many ways.
All right. Hey, well, thank you very much for that. That's a wrap for this week, but we'll be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.
Thanks, Matthew.